I'm going to introduce both of our speakers simultaneously with their presentation. So we're going to start with James today, and then we'll go to Shiloh. So James, my peer and colleague, friend, is originally from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, moved to Phoenix, Arizona in 2008, and then to Tucson in June of 2021. He has a BFA, 2020. I'm sorry, that was my bad. He has a BFA and MA in art education from Arizona State University. His studio interests include watercolor painting, printmaking, and ceramics, while his research includes public pedagogy, exploring the practice of socially engaged art, technology, and the role of meaningful interactions it can provide, and a continued attempt to understand and explore his role as a teacher, researcher, and artist. All right, James, take it away.
Okay, can everyone see? Okay. I point up to it because it's on a second screen above mine. I am already beyond the Zoom presentation world and have acclimated back to life and interaction. So anyway, this is Doodles in the Margins. Looking at doodles, zines, and sequential imagery as a collective visual learning experience. For those who don't know or maybe not know, sequential imagery is a real fancy way of saying comics, comic books, comic strips, and stuff like that. So just to start off with, one of the things that really instigated this idea was this project from Dr. Sharma's intro to our research class. And this is really just an idea that kind of presents this fantastical device through which you can kind of look to see or determine what kind of research you're doing, what kind of questions you're asking, your method, your methodology, all that sort of thing. As you can see, there's a combination of obviously words and visuals to communicate a point. And the idea behind the whole thing is really to look at a way to address, incorporate, identify, potentially take advantage of, however you'd like to look at it, all the different complex layers of not just our existence, but the existence of people that we're working with or talking to, and also like the methods and the things that we're doing. So that's one of the major motivations behind this. And obviously it's impossible to see all this at once, but there's nothing wrong with imagining and trying to think about how to do it. And I think the visual perspective and the way that things can be broken down can really kind of help facilitate that thought. So this is that two major like academic kind of inspirations or influences. The first one is Nick Susanis. I don't know if you all have heard of him or not, but on the right is a portion of his dissertation, which was an entirely graphic novel called Unflattening. I can't recommend it enough. On the left is an actual syllabus from last spring of 21. So you can see there, the left is a little bit more word heavy, but you can tell still just with the incorporation of images and how it looks, just the way the timeline goes, it has a completely different feel, different type of engagement to it also. Then this, of course, is Jim Woglam and Steph Jones on mutant pedagogies. This is, again, a peer-reviewed, much longer graphic novel research study. And one of the major things that I want to point out is on the left panel. This looked at a fissure is an illustration of institutionally acceptable textual composition. So there are a couple of heavy ideas in there. It's really Deleuze and Guattari inspired, but basically looking at how to create sort of a rupture or an opening in what we considered standard academic or acceptable within a certain framework or with a certain institution. And here we're really addressing the academic institution, specifically researching in PhD sort of talk and research and publications. So this was the question and method. So could a collective visual note-taking experience possibly contributing to this be beneficial for students? So this started like from that sort of idea and project. Margo and I worked on this as like a pilot study to begin with. So everything that's coming through here next, I'm speaking of from my takeaways and my interpretations and what really resonated with me. I'd invite Margo to jump in if feel like there's anything pertinent or relevant or unique, but just keep that in mind as well, that there is a whole nother side of this, but I am going to speak on my own perspective. So the methods, it was really kind of a mixed method thing. We had quantitative questions that gauged interest and kind of gauged reactions, and qualitative questions that were kind of designed to get insights and understandings, have participants have a chance to kind of contribute on their own volition. The literature review piece of it I thought was pretty interesting. First thing was looking at Doodle, and really started with Doodle because I think it can be likened to zines in a lot of ways, just in the fact that everyone's really capable of doing it. Most people have done it. Some of you might do it now. Some of you may be doing it now, which would be fantastic. I would really encourage that. But first of all, there's a great amount of research on doodling for mental health. So these are just a couple of the highlights. So I don't know if anyone out there right now has or is experiencing mental fatigue, potentially anxiety, frustration and boredom. We talked a little bit about burnout at the beginning, but there are studies that kind of support that this sort of expression and these sort of activities and motions, both in a motor sense and in like putting and channeling these inner anxieties out through your body into something creative, it's actually really beneficial for us. So I thought that was an important piece. And then, of course, in education, there are studies again about it. You know, I don't know if anyone's gotten yelled at for doodling in class, but there's actually benefits towards retention. There's benefits in terms of increased performance and improved grades. Also with different populations. So the last one, Borison, there was a sketchnoting concept that was pretty interesting. The study focused on students with autism, but all of the findings are really universal. So I think in today's day and age with our technology and how our attention spans are much smaller, this is something that could be really beneficial. Then onto zines, zine as an art form. So most of you are familiar with them, but basically little self-made sort of publications, as rudimentary as basic as possible, but could also be fairly advanced. But the idea and the major thing here is this do-it-yourself ethos. The self-publishing factor of it is very subversive, and I think that's what really attracted me personally to it, and why I gravitated to it, was to explore this idea of presenting an alternate way of presenting knowledge, presenting something that you didn't have to have 3 degrees just to read, and then still struggle to understand it at times. So the idea, again, is accessibility towards any and everybody, whatever your walk of life is, whatever your degree may or may not be in, wherever you're from. And then in education, there are a number of benefits also. One of my favorite things here is that a study where they were sort of autoethnographic and an archival process, and they act as a temporal conduit of connections, which I think is an interesting kind of way of saying they captured moments and experiences in time for other people and other students to potentially latch onto. These were the surveys. Some of you may have participated in them, some not. Looking at it, I thought about some notes and ideas for a second version of it. Obviously, combination of closed and open questions, open-ended questions, it can limit some answers. There's so many words for a visual-based study. So I think there's some opportunity there. There are no visuals at all, and there's not really a direct prompt to create a visual response. So these are things that I considered and actually continued to work on since this study finished, which was really end of April, beginning of May. Here's just a quick example of some of the coding. On the right, I include Margo's coding. That was one of her techniques that she used. On the left is how I work through mine. I went through, I've added things since this was finished, and continued to change the color spectrum a little bit. But I also think it's kind of interesting to see just the way it looks and the way the data looks when you actually exclude the data, and really just kind of go on your interpretations or your perceptions and what you might think is positive, neutral, or negative, or maybe just an opportunity or a one-off, something like that. These are just some kind of interpretations and general learnings. I think that what I found in a number of students, again, since the initial study, is a lot of students now take notes on their computer. So many don't quite doodle as much. But there was some interest in what the project was about. I think there's a little bit of confusion on what exactly a zine is, whereas other folks really, really knew for sure. So I think there could be some clarity, but I also like the ambiguous nature of kind of defining what a visual representation means to you. So I don't think that actually labeling and pigeonholing anything as a zine is necessarily critical to the success of an idea or a project like this. And this is where I think it gets a little bit interesting, and this is my own classroom experimentation. So teaching a class this semester, I'm talking about two different projects where it's pretty standard. Hand out the readings, and then there's a lecture based on them, and then there's a discussion. Well, the first one was really sort of this idea word-based group presentation type project where they created a poster. And you can see there's lots of words again, there are lots of ideas. Good. The bottom right-hand corner, you can see one group already incorporated some imagery to it. But then the second one, I combined with this piece, which is Dr. Hayward Rowland Jr.'s. It's a piece from his idea of bringing in literature to the art education toolbox, but I kind of inverted it because a lot of our readings and lectures and all that sort of thing are, they're obviously word and dialogue driven. So I thought about how can we bring some visuals into it? And this is what the group came up with. And the best way that I can compare this in a short amount of time is that these images, all four of them, each group, and the conversation, the dialogue that was generated from this lasted the entire class. I had to facilitate next to nothing. This was each group of students kind of talking, reacting, and engaging with each other's work in a way that was much more organic, much more natural, and just really overall far more positive. Definitely made my position a little bit easier. So I asked then, we did a research project, and one group actually reflected on this and decided that they were going to do a pretty straightforward PowerPoint presentation, but then also incorporate a version of this on their own, where they made their own visual, something that the group could contribute to, that acted as an art project kind of on its own, but was also from like a public community artwork perspective with engagement. These are some of the these are some of the responses. I asked the class about that. Again, this is something that I followed up on afterwards, and it was just interesting to see how overwhelmingly positive the reaction to this was. Again, metaphorical thinking helps people relate and remember. It helped them conceptualize some of the complex topics we discussed. Again, deeper conversation, that's a quote from one of the students. So I think overall it was a very positive experience and different than typical things. And just in summary here, this is really kind of the goal and the process is to sort of go from this standard legitimized like document looking thing to potential a comic type thing that's also very accessible, but then also like a one-off sort of print, something that is you know, again, something that's kind of low stakes, something that's playful and engaging for anyone or people from different art backgrounds. And these are my references, and that's it. I went over by about 2 minutes, so I apologize. Thanks.
That timing went very well, actually. So no worries there. I'm going to open up the floor to any questions or comments for James. And if you don't want to unmute and use your voice, you can type them in the chat and I can read them aloud as well.
So James, how do you, so knowing that so many classes are very much document driven, how would you go about starting to incorporate this in a curriculum that may be a little bit more apprehensive, and that way you can kind of start to test the waters?
Yeah, I think what we did is actually the way that I would probably try it again, and that's to kind of line up and present things somewhat typically and build the class around engagement more so, and like a problem posing methodology and pedagogical approach, instead of kind of deconstruct that idea that I'm going to tell you what you need to know and give you all the boxes to check. You've got to go find all these things and go check all those boxes. So I think undoing that was really the first step. I think the second step was to kind of create the idea that we're going to work together and we're going to feed off of one another. And that collaboration is crucial to what we're doing, especially in the class that we're in, which is community-based class. And then to kind of, I think I had just happened to find Hayward Rolling's piece, and I thought, this is perfect. Like, this is actually what I'm envisioning. So I just put it up and kind of said, hey, this was just published. This is actually legitimate, and there's a lot of things behind this. So let's play and go in this direction real quick. And then, it just happened to work out really, really well. So maybe it was that group, maybe it was just this perfect combination of ideas. Like that week, we were talking about our focus literature was on interventionist art. So we had a couple different types of reading, something very, very accessible, something a little more challenging, and then something that was just almost discouragingly, mind-numbingly hard to read. I think that one ended up getting put on the back burner a bit, but what we were able to do was incorporate that. And that's one of the reasons that understand complex concepts came up, was because through this sort of interaction and visualization, we were able to discuss that reading much more fully and got a lot more out of it. So I think part of it is kind of undoing what we've been trained to do, and just setting this idea that there's not a hierarchy of events necessarily. The old rhizome creeps back into play. So there are connections, there are entries, there are exits everywhere. And it's really more like the onus is on you to identify where it is you're going to get into the conversation, and then present alternatives. So there are students that can write and do what they want to. I mean, that's totally fine. But yeah, I mean, I think that's really kind of the process. That's a really long answer, and I apologize.
It was a good answer. That's definitely, I like the fact that you really kind of thought this through.
I think the other thing is, it kind of reminds me of a question I got asked, excuse me, last time, was like about the next version of a survey, and on one hand, you question the idea of this survey that's all words when it's talking about really all visual types of communication and presentation of ideas and research. But you also want I think that I would like to have an opportunity for folks that don't necessarily want to engage in art to feel like they can still engage with the research, the conversation. You don't want to alienate anybody. And, maybe halfway through they decide, well, I'm not that good of an artist, but you know what, we're just talking about doodles, so I'm going to do this, So I think there's still, you can't close off any potential participants or ideas.
I'm going to say, just to keep on track with time, let's go ahead and have Shiloh present, and then we'll use the remaining time to ask any questions of everyone. And then if anyone has questions for James in the time being, write them in the chat, and then we're going to circle back. So I'm going to present Shiloh now. Let me get. All right, so Shiloh Fontes is an MA student in Art and Visual Culture Education at the University of Arizona. Her research interests range from creativity in the modern world to finding the right blend of art and design to break the STEM barriers facing K through 12 audiences. She is currently the design and planetarium specialist at Flandreau Science Center and Planetarium, as well as the editor of the Planetarian Journal. All right, Shiloh, thank you for being here.
Hi. All right, let me go ahead and share my screen and see if I don't lose my mouse again. All right. Hello. So, as Margo mentioned, I've got a variety of interests, and one of them is currently looking at creativity and the effects that COVID-19 pandemic has had on it. And this sort of came into play, not so much just because it was an initial sort of interest, but sort of out of necessity, because so many of us found ourselves in a brand new world right in March 2020. So 2020 felt like a black hole. We were basically all thrown into this disarray of not knowing what was coming, what was happening next. And it kind of shook a lot of us to our core. And something I learned, and I learned from a lot of my colleagues and friends, is that it was just dreadful. Like it seemed like there was no end in sight for the longest time. And I began to find that I was very frustrated. I couldn't create the way I thought I was able to create in the past. Some of my hobbies include drawing and photography, and I just felt no interest, nothing. And turns out I wasn't the only one. So it kind of led into this big question, is like, what is the effect of this on our creativity? And essentially, what is creativity? I'm gonna kind of go quickly through these last two slides. At the time when we first started this, it was everywhere. It was brand new virus. No one knew what was going on. Spread and transmission was questionable. No one really fully understood what was going on. And everyone just kind of shut down. And at the time, we were all hoping the vaccine would be the silver bullet, the fixing. Now it's still continuing. The spread has changed. It often mimics other illnesses. We have variants, but the future is still, unfortunately, unknown. So why is the overall question for this? And what I wanted to look at was, oops, there we go. What is creativity? So for most of us, we just kind of think of creativity as the ability to do something artistic. But what I was learning is that there was more than one kind of creativity. So I've come up with this definition between big creativity and little creativity. So big creativity in this case is going to be the creativity you use for your professional work. So your job, if you're a freelancer, or if you work in a creative field, if you're a teacher, that sort of creativity. And then little c creativity is your personal creativity, things that are your own outlet, things that allow your artistic side to flourish, or even just getting to do something that's more arts based. And it was really interesting to kind of learn this delineation, because all of a sudden people were having to think about how to be creative in their jobs by working remote. So I did a call for questions, mostly all on the internet, because of course at that point in time we couldn't be in person. And I got several participants, and I was actually asking people how they define creativity. Since the definition of creativity for me was evolving, I was curious to see if it was evolving for anyone else who considered themselves to be a creative person. So I had this brief little survey. I got 6 respondents, different types. I had a gamut, and I gave them the survey. And I was actually really interested to see how BAS would work. This was still fairly early in the pandemic, and people were already Zoomed out. I had given them the option to either interview in person via Zoom, or to fill out a survey via email. And everyone chose email. And I was talking to one of my colleagues, and they were like, yeah, honestly, if you had asked me to do it via Zoom, I would have been, no, thank you. No more Zoom for me. So it's interesting to see how now this has become part of our everyday life, but that is a complete tangent. The participants had different responses. Some people lost their jobs, unfortunately. This participant had a job that was in the wedding invitation industry, so they were doing art as part of their job, and they were no longer able to do that. And they actually were quite surprised at how much it affected everything else. So those different outlets really do play a huge role in each other. What I thought was interesting, so Karen Kiefer Boyd had this statement, like, visual culture, therefore, from post-human perspectives, is produced by relationships and interactions which humans are not the center of visual culture production, although humans tend to presume to be the center of life, which is latter half is a little harsh, but the idea is the fact is most of us are not creative in a vacuum. We tend to be creative due to our interactions with people or our responses to life events or things we've seen or places we've gone. So remove everything that we tend to interact with, and you're going to affect that ability to create that culture. For some people, just even the routine change totally affected their ability to be creative. So back to Kiefer Boyd's statement. So not being able to go somewhere else, being stuck in one's place. And there were a lot of studies done on mental health at this point, because being all of a sudden having your world turn upside down. Some people were losing family and friends. Some people weren't able to leave their houses at all, played a really big role in your mental health. And for a lot of people, choosing to be creative was a way to kind of work on that outlet. And now that was gone. So what do we do now? Another participant was talking about those interactions again, backing up that statement from Kiefer Boyd that interactions were what really helped to be creative. What I thought was interesting is this participant went into talking about social media. And as we've learned over the past year, social media has actually the ability to be incredibly toxic. This thing that we began to rely on as our only like connection to other people really began to affect people's self-esteem, mental status. A lot of people were just doubting what they were doing. You know, that person's life looks so much more glamorous, and all these things. So again, that once creative outlet that gave us connections was becoming an actual toxic place, and still is. And we're beginning to see more and more how social media really is not so great, but again, another topic. And so we were finding out like words for how we were feeling. So Adam Grant came up with the word languishing. So sometimes things didn't feel great, but sometimes things were okay. But it was just this weird like state of limbo. And that was actually a really good term for it, because everyone was like, well, what is it that we're experiencing? Apparently languishing was the word. So the results that I came from after going through the statement are through this study, creativity was mostly a state of mind. A lot of participants actually then found themselves becoming more creative at work because they couldn't have that personal creativity. Two of my participants created visual video tours of their facilities. I created a YouTube series for my job. Another participant actually was re-looking at all of his photography work in a different light. So when you have the time to kind of sit and go through it, all of a sudden you begin to see things that you hadn't seen before. And it really made them think about, okay, well, what do I want my photography job to say about me? Like, how do I want this to represent myself? So on one hand, it seemed like this time to be introspective really gave people this kind of delve into their professional creativity in ways they may have not before. But it still really did affect that personal creativity. I would really like to go back and kind of study that more. There's the, sorry, my dog just moved. There's the participant who really wanted to look at their photography and get a new viewpoint. So really, it's just this idea of a change in the way we think about being creative, and jobs that typically wouldn't be creative that are now having bits of creativity to adjust for everything. So what's next? I'd really like to actually take this research further. My first study was done without IRBs at the time because it was for a paper. I would really like to apply for an IRB to go back into further research, see how things are going in this current state of semi-normalcy, because we're still in this, but a lot of things have opened back up as if things were normal. People are experiencing burnout in different ways, back in jobs, but not back in jobs. So there's a lot of variables now that I think would be really interesting to visit and see how that affects creativity. And then of course, what can we learn from this as far as creativity goes and what we're doing? That's it. Thank you. And lots of references to look at. So thanks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shiloh. I'm going to open up the floor again for questions for Shiloh's presentation, and then take probably a couple minutes there, and then open it up to questions for both James and Shiloh.
Hi, Shiloh. I had a question about just research in this area. It seems like this is such an emerging topic, and that things are coming out a lot quicker all of a sudden. And so I wonder if you could talk about like ways that it's changed since the early days of the pandemic. I know like you shared that article about burnout last night in class. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about like if the conversation's changed or like how it's evolving.
It's really interesting because at first there was this big push early in the pandemic to be productive, to create new things, to garden, to create sourdough, which to be fair, I did both of those, but to actually start doing all of these things. And that was at a time where I think people just assumed that this was going to be a short-term thing. So early on, a lot of the articles that were coming out about the effect of the pandemic on people was just like, okay, this is just new, like we'll sort this out. Fast forward 6 months, we're still continuing along this road of uncertainty. People are looking for something at this point. So then we start to see the articles coming out about this idea of languishing and this like the lamenting of the loss of a previous life, basically. So almost going through like if you've lost a loved one was kind of the analogy a lot of articles made. But now we're getting to the point where some of the articles and topics that are coming out is like, well, how are we adjusting at this point? Because we've seen not only in the creative industry, but most industries in general, business as usual has been expected the entire time. And we're starting to see the effects of that and the mistakes that's basically kind of created because we couldn't have actually continued to be at that state. Like you mentioned, the article I found yesterday on burnout was actually done pre-pandemic. I'd love to see it done now, but we've just always attributed these kind of feelings to being overworked or overthinking it, or often as artist types are put as being overly dramatic. But now we're beginning to see this in a broader culture sense. And so we're starting to now have to rethink these cultural norms that we've created and why they're there and maybe what needs to change. So it's been really interesting to see kind of how the evolution is going, which is why I really want to revisit with the people I have surveyed before and see how things are going now.
That was going to be my next question.
Yeah, I really do. So now that the IRB system changed, I really need to figure out how that works and try and go through that because I'd like to see this through in addition to the other research areas I'm doing. So
that's great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question.
Yes.
I think that a lot of what you were talking about and presenting as far as like this like reflection on something that we all would have never assumed to happen in our lifetime. Like we don't really expect these kind of things to happen. Do you think that this was potentially a good thing, and to be able to kind of experience this and in order to kind of like shift a critical eye on like how you said, like why do we do things like culturally or socially?
I have to be really careful on how I say this, but in a way, yes, because we've looked at a lot of movements in the past historically through education, and it takes these really big things for shifts to start happening. And we're beginning to see that people are putting themselves first now versus putting their employers first, which is a question, why was it ever done first? And of course you break down the system and look at, okay, well, we've got a system based on monetary capitalism. So how do we then put the human back into that in the forefront? But I think we needed something big to start doing a lot of shifts. And the shift of putting the human first, I think, is the biggest thing that's come out of this. Not only do you look at the self-care, not the capitalistic self-care, but the actual like care of the human, the psyche first, but then you look at how we're beginning to understand the treatment of our fellow mankind. And we're like, okay, this is no longer acceptable because we're getting to see the complete inequity of how everything has panned out and affected. So yeah, but the same thing, I mean, to maybe oversimplify it, the same thing happened after the Great Plague back in the 16th century in Europe. It was actually the cause for higher wages for workers, because now they needed people to come back to work, and they realized that they needed to pay them a living wage. So, you know, you hate to say it, but sometimes good things come from terrible, terrible tragedies.
Thank you for answering my question. We're nearing we're kind of getting to that time. So I want to give everyone the opportunity to ask both of our speakers today, if you have any questions for either of them separately or in tandem.
James, I did have another question for yours. Have you thought about how you might bring doodling outside of a classroom to more community areas, whether it be museums or outdoor gardens, or even just, you know, we've seen how doodling and just plain drawing in nature can be beneficial to a person. So have you thought about how to bring that outside of that classroom experience?
Generally, no. And part of that is because I don't have a lot of outside the class experiences right now. So, and over the summer, most of my interactions weren't really, they were conversational, and they were in situations where it would have been kind of weird and uncomfortable, like, hey, can we doodle some stuff real quick, you know? So just kind of naturally going with it and following the path that it was on hasn't quite taken me there yet. I think back to my previous experience and how that kind of shaped the idea of just going to places and going into random places. And I think that's definitely a bit of a challenge to look at. So I'm kind of intrigued by the idea of sort of developing like a body of work, you know, with participants and with myself, with Margo, or with anybody that wants to contribute, and then sort of working with that and seeing where it goes in different areas. So yeah, it's not really the makings of like the best IRB proposal right there, but that's sort of that's sort of what I'm thinking about, and then I add in the structure as needed, I think.
Gotcha.
Well, I still want to, I mean, we only have 4 minutes until our session is up. So I don't want to, I obviously don't want to like close it down if anyone's got like any questions, but I just wanted to say thank you to Shiloh and James for sharing today. I think from my perspective, kind of talking about in relation to James's presentation, it's very, very cool for me to have like been a part of that process, and to also see like potentially where this could go in the future, that I'm really excited about. And then also thinking about a lot of what I actually think that these two presentations together really complement each other a lot, because this is something that we discussed a ton as far as creativity and the importance of that mental health attribute, especially in our like contemporary context with COVID, and sort of how we're all navigating that. So I was really happy as far as like an organizer of emerging conversations that this happened together. So thank you guys.
I think there's a lot to be said for everything that's coming out as far as mental wellness, and how just the littlest things. Most people might be like, oh, it's a doodle, but a doodle can go a long way just to even just relaxing one's mind. So I think that's been really one of the better things to come out of this. Again, like I said, just the treating of the self better.
Great. Well, that is about our time. So thank you guys so much. And thank you for the participants who came to watch our presentations.
Yes, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks. I'm going to go ahead and end the meeting.
Bye
Thank you
all.
so much.
Thank you.
You guys are awesome. Cindy Wallace clapped. Oh, cool. All right.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. It was good talking.